A world burned beneath a calculated rain of fire, cities collapsing like fragile bones. In the spire above, humans sat calmly, sipping water, checking systems, and sending reports on casualties, as if the explosions were nothing more than inconvenient background noise. Sensors screamed, alarms howled, dust rained like gray snow, and still, they did not flee. The universe had expected surrender. Instead, it got endurance. Logic faltered. Probability failed. And for the first time, every observer realized humanity was not afraid of death. Humanity was redefining it. Vibrations crawled through the council chamber like a living thing, a low subsonic thrum that settled into bone and alloy alike as distant orbital strikes reached the atmosphere of Caraxes. The sound was not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, a reminder transmitted through hull and station frame that violence was unfolding below. The air smelled faintly of ionized metal and coolant, sterilized and recycled until it carried no trace of life. Light from the dying blue star washed across the chamber in slow pulses, its radiation filtered into soft bands of color that never changed, never surprised. The Council of Measured Species had been forged for moments exactly like this. It existed in the comfort of certainty, suspended above entropy, yet insulated from chaos. Its chambers orbited the star because the star was predictable, its decay mapped centuries in advance, its final collapse comfortably distant. Here, probability was law. Every surface, every structural beam, every orbital correction was calculated to the smallest tolerances. Emotion had been engineered out long ago, replaced with metrics, thresholds, and acceptable losses. War, within this space, was not an event but a solved equation. Campaigns were simulated until all variables converged. Victory and defeat were not moral concepts, but statistical outcomes. When the first bombardment vessels entered orbit over Caraxes, the Council registered the action as a correction rather than an escalation. The planet sat on a border that offended symmetry and efficiency. Its resistance had exceeded projected compliance by a fractional margin, and that margin demanded adjustment. Data streams flowed in silence. Seismic readings bloomed across holographic displays like slow flowers of light. Atmospheric ignition patterns traced elegant arcs as kinetic projectiles struck cities that had once pulsed with heat and movement. The Council observed without reaction, noting infrastructure collapse curves and population displacement vectors. The equations indicated compliance within hours, followed by orderly annexation and resource normalization. Casualties fell within acceptable ranges. Cultural loss was logged and discounted. Within the chamber, there was no sense of urgency. Environmental fields held temperature at a constant, comfortable equilibrium. Gravity remained precisely calibrated. The faint tremor from each distant impact never rose above tolerable limits. Council members processed outcomes in parallel, each consciousness synchronized to shared predictive models. There was no fear here, no doubt, only the quiet assurance of inevitability. Negotiation protocols remained inactive. Across the long history of measured civilizations, dialogue occurred only after weapons fell silent. To speak during bombardment was inefficient, emotionally compromised, and strategically unsound. Survival curves did not support discourse under active fire. Species that attempted it historically fractured or collapsed entirely. The Council had learned this lesson across millennia and encoded it into doctrine. Below them, on Caraxes, cities burned and skies fractured. Above them, the dying star continued its slow, graceful decay. Between these two certainties, the Council waited, confident that the universe would once again behave as it always had. Logic ruled. The guns would finish speaking soon, and only then, as precedent demanded, would words be permitted to exist. The first kinetic impact reached Caraxes with a sound that never touched the vacuum, a distant violence translated into vibration and light by instruments that had never known fear. In the reinforced observation rings, the tremor arrived as a measured oscillation through the Station S frame, a polite shiver designed to remain below discomfort thresholds. Sensors bloomed to life, painting the planet's crust in cascading waves of data as shock fronts raced through stone and mantle. From orbit, The world looked like a dark ocean struck by invisible rain, each impact rippling outward in perfect, terrible geometry. The council observed without movement. Their forms, varied in shape and substance, were anchored within gravitic cradles and neural lattices, minds linked to predictive arrays older than most stars. The smell within the rings was antiseptic and cold, a faint tang of sterilized air and ozone from continuously cycling systems. No heat from the bombardment reached them, only numbers, curves, and probabilities flowing in endless streams. The dying blue star beyond the viewport shed its pale light across the chamber, washing alien faces and chitin and synthetic skin in hues that never warmed. Below, the bombardment intensified. Kinetic rods fell in disciplined patterns, each one calculated to fracture infrastructure rather than waste energy on spectacle. Cities collapsed inward, their outlines dissolving into thermal scars. Atmospheric readings spiked as fires spread, feeding on oxygen and hope alike. Population displacement vectors stretched and twisted, showing millions of lives reduced to moving points, scattering away from annihilation zones with no guarantee of escape. To the Council, it was all familiar, another iteration of a solved problem. Delegations from a dozen rational empires occupied secondary rings, their presence marked by subtle shifts in electromagnetic signatures and localized gravity distortions. They prepared formal ceasefire demands, assembling legal frameworks and compliance clauses with practiced efficiency. Their certainty was absolute. Across galactic history, no species had maintained coherent diplomatic function while its home burned beneath orbital fire. Survival curves dipped, morale collapsed, command structures fractured, and reason reasserted itself through retreat or surrender. This was not cruelty, but adaptation. Those who lived learned to yield. Historical models reinforced the assumption. Thousands of recorded conflicts, spanning evolutionary trees and star clusters, told the same story. When survival probability fell below acceptable thresholds, rational actors withdrew from negotiation spaces, preserving leadership and culture where possible. To remain engaged while extinction loomed was classified as maladaptive behavior, a precursor to total collapse. The Council's archives were filled with cautionary case studies, species that had clung to principle until nothing remained to cling with. The human variable was expected to resolve itself just as cleanly. Their envoys occupied a negotiation spire tethered to the council station by a slender docking arm, a structure never designed to endure sustained bombardment resonance. The spire's walls groaned faintly as distant impacts translated through gravitational harmonics. Fine dust drifted from microfractures in the ceiling, sparkling briefly in the star's filtered light before settling on polished floors. Emergency fields compensated automatically, smoothing out pressure fluctuations and sealing microscopic breaches. The Council monitored the human presence with detached interest. Biometric feeds showed elevated stress responses, accelerated cardiac rhythms, and adrenal spikes consistent with acute danger. These readings aligned perfectly with expectations. Analysts marked the trend and projected imminent withdrawal. No species, however young or idealistic, chose discourse over survival once the math turned against them. The humans would evacuate, the spire would be abandoned, and negotiations would resume later under calmer, more rational circumstances. The bombardment deepened. Orbital platforms adjusted trajectories, increasing strike density as resistance failed to materialize on the surface. Shockwaves overlapped, their interference patterns producing complex tremors that crept along the docking arm and into the spire. The Council felt them as mild disturbances, like a distant storm felt through thick stone. To them, it was still within acceptable parameters. To those below, it was the sound of a world breaking. Observers noted the subtle reactions among allied delegations. Some registered faint discomfort, an instinctive aversion to witnessing annihilation even from safety. Others focused inward, refining their ceasefire language, confident it would soon be delivered to an empty chamber. The logic was unassailable. Negotiation under fire was noise, not signal. Words required silence to have meaning. Yet time passed, measured in orbital rotations and data refresh cycles, and the human envoys did not depart. The spire remained occupied. Environmental readings showed continued life support usage, steady power consumption, and ongoing internal activity. This anomaly was logged, flagged for review, then temporarily dismissed as delay or miscommunication. Withdrawal procedures, once initiated, often took time. Another wave of impact struck Caraxes, brighter and more violent than the last. The planet's night side flared like a wounded thing, fires outlining continents in jagged lines of orange and white. The Council's displays adjusted contrast automatically, preserving clarity. Casualty projections updated, ticking upward but remaining within predicted bounds. Compliance probability remained high. The models did not waver. Still, the humans remained. Within the spire, biometric feeds stabilized rather than spiked. Stress indicators plateaued, then dipped slightly, a pattern that confused several monitoring subroutines. The Council's systems compensated, smoothing anomalies into statistical noise. There was no precedent for calm persistence under escalating threat, but the algorithms were designed to absorb outliers without alarm. Rational systems trusted averages, not exceptions. The waiting continued. The Council did not hurry. Time, like war, was a resource to be spent efficiently. They expected the moment of withdrawal to arrive suddenly, marked by evacuation signatures and a sharp drop in life signs. When it did not, the absence itself began to register as data. Across the observation rings, the dying star pulsed, its light reflecting off armored viewports and alien eyes. Below, a human world endured fire and gravity and fear. Between them, suspended in cold certainty, the Council waited for reason to assert itself. They did not yet understand that reason, as humanity defined it, did not always point toward survival. Metal screamed as the first human vessel cut through the orbital kill zone, its hull glowing white where shields flared and tore, shedding energy in ragged auroras that bled into the void. The sound never traveled, yet the violence announced itself through light and telemetry, through the sudden spike of radiation and debris that splashed across every sensor array watching from safety. Fragments of superheated alloy spiraled away like dying stars, and the vacuum filled with the ghostly shimmer of failed defenses collapsing one layer at a time. The approach vectors made no sense. Simulations collapsed under their own contradictions as human ships advanced directly through patterns designed to force retreat. Probability curves bent, then snapped. Where logic predicted evasive withdrawal, the vessels pressed forward, engines burning with a fury that translated into heat signatures visible across entire orbital arcs. The shields did not hold as they should have, flaring too bright, failing too fast, then reasserting themselves in crude, desperate cycles that no optimization algorithm would ever approve. It looked inefficient. It looked suicidal. The negotiation spire loomed ahead, a scarred relic tethered to the Council station by a slender arm of reinforced matter. Its surface bore fresh fractures, long fissures glowing faintly where internal fields strained to contain pressure and atmosphere. Each distant impact on Caraxes sent tremors rippling through its structure, turning ancient alloys into groaning things that flexed and complained under stresses they were never meant to endure. Dust drifted constantly now, a fine gray powder shaken loose from decorative stone and ceremonial metals that had survived millennia of peace only to crumble under modern war. Docking clamps engaged with a shudder that ran the length of the spire. The impact reverberated through corridors and chambers, knocking loose more debris and triggering a cascade of environmental alarms. Layered harmonics wailed through the structure, overlapping tones designed for species with radically different sensory ranges. Some screamed in frequencies that scraped along neural pathways. Others pulsed as vibrations felt deep in bone and shell. Emergency lights strobed, bathing the interior in alternating bands of red and sterile white. The humans arrived into this chaos without haste. Airlocks cycled under strain, seals biting down hard against warped frames. Pressure equalized unevenly, producing sharp pops and hisses as systems fought to compensate. The smell of scorched insulation and hot metal mingled with the recycled air, carrying the bitter tang of ozone and the faint, unmistakable scent of fear. Yet the human delegation moved with deliberate precision, their motions economical, practiced, almost ritualistic. They did not run. They did not shout. They stabilized. Portable field generators deployed, their hums adding new layers to the alarm chorus as they reinforced failing bulkheads. Breach foam blossomed across hairline cracks, expanding and hardening in seconds, sealing wounds in the spire's skin. Manual overrides were thrown where automated systems lagged, human hands working switches and panels with intimate familiarity born of long experience with things breaking at the worst possible moments. Each action was small, almost mundane, yet together they formed a quiet defiance against the surrounding annihilation. Observers within the council rings recorded every detail. Heart rates climbed and remained elevated, stress markers spiked and refused to settle, cortisol and adrenaline surged through human bodies at levels flagged as dangerous by most medical standards. Muscles trembled with fatigue held at bay by sheer will. Breathing patterns showed controlled irregularity, the subtle signatures of beings consciously mastering panic rather than eliminating it. Pain receptors fired as microgravity shifts and structural vibrations jarred joints and spines. And still, there was no retreat. The humans took their places within the negotiation chamber, as though the violence outside were a storm rather than an extinction event. They anchored themselves to the floor with magnetic restraints, adjusted seating that had been designed for alien anatomies, and secured loose objects that might become shrapnel if the next tremor hit harder. Dust settled on their clothing and exposed skin, clinging with static insistence. Some brushed it away out of habit, small gestures of cleanliness performed even as the floor shuddered beneath them. Outside, another wave of kinetic strikes hit Caraxes. The tremor that followed was stronger, rolling through the spire in a deep, resonant pulse that rattled fixtures and sent a visible ripple across the chamber's floor. Cracks widened. Emergency fields brightened in response, drawing more power, pushing systems closer to failure. For a moment, gravity fluctuated, a nauseating lurch that lifted bodies and loose debris alike before slamming them back down. The humans absorbed it. Their posture changed subtly, knees bending, muscles bracing, spines aligning to ride out the shock. Teeth clenched, hands tightened. A few heads bowed briefly, not in surrender, but in focus, as if counting heartbeats or steadying breath. Then they were still again, eyes forward, attention fixed not on the destruction beyond the walls but on the task they had come to perform. To the council, this behavior defied classification. The absence of retreat responses triggered cascading flags across analytical systems. Models searched for hidden incentives, undisclosed reinforcements, secret fail-safes that might explain such persistence. None were found. The human vessels that had delivered the delegation drifted damaged and vulnerable outside, their hulls scored, their shields exhausted. There was no overwhelming force waiting in reserve, no unseen advantage that justified the risk. What remained was endurance. The negotiation chamber, once a place of controlled symbolism and balanced geometry, now felt raw and exposed. Polished alien stone lay dulled under layers of dust. Light flickered as power rerouted, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and twisted with each vibration. The temperature dipped and rose in uneven waves as environmental systems struggled to maintain equilibrium. Every sense reported instability, impermanence, the fragile truth that all structures could fail. Within that truth, the humans persisted. They existed as warm, breathing contradictions to the cold math that governed the council. Their presence radiated heat detectable even through layers of insulation, a subtle thermal bloom that marked them as alive in a way sensors could quantify but not fully explain. They carried with them the accumulated weight of a species that had learned, over countless catastrophes, that survival was not always about minimizing loss. Sometimes it was about refusing to leave. As the bombardment continued and the spire endured, observers recorded a final, unsettling data point. Despite fear, despite pain, despite the constant, bone-deep knowledge that death was a single failure away, the humans remained engaged. Not frozen, not resigned, present. In the vastness of space, under the indifferent light of a dying star, fragile lives sat calmly within shaking walls and chose to stay. Water sloshed softly against the inner walls of transparent containers as another tremor rolled through the negotiation chamber, the liquid briefly lifting in defiance of gravity before settling again. The sound was small, almost intimate, easily lost beneath the groan of stressed supports and the distant, ever-present vibration of bombardment. The air tasted dry and metallic, stripped of freshness by overworked recyclers and laced with the faint bitterness of overheated circuits. Light flickered, not enough to plunge the chamber into darkness, but enough to remind every living body inside that stability was an illusion maintained moment to moment. The humans drank. They tilted the containers with steady hands, swallowing measured mouthfuls, replenishing fluids as if preparing for a long march rather than a sudden evacuation. Throats worked, muscles contracting and releasing in a rhythm older than spaceflight, older than war. Sensors recorded the action with clinical detachment, tagging hydration levels, electrolyte balances, and metabolic rates. To the Council's analysts, it was baffling. Under active bombardment, standard doctrine prioritized mobility and withdrawal readiness. Consuming water suggested endurance, an intention to remain. Another impact shuddered through the spire, stronger than the last. The floor vibrated in a low, bone-deep resonance that rattled teeth and blurred vision for a heartbeat. Dust cascaded from overhead seams, settling on shoulders, on data slates, on the smooth surfaces of alien stone that had once gleamed untouched. Emergency fields flared brighter, casting harsh white halos around structural struts. Temperature dipped sharply, then rebounded as environmental systems overcorrected. The humans adjusted without comment. Clothing was pulled tighter against sudden chill. Footing was widened to maintain balance. One by one, they secured their containers, stowing them within reach rather than discarding them. Hydration, like breath, was treated as a necessity to be managed, not a luxury to be sacrificed. Data flowed across their interfaces, streams of information pulled from planetary sensors, civilian networks, and humanitarian satellites still clinging to function below. Images of fractured cities, of thermal blooms where neighborhoods had been, of mass movement across scarred terrain scrolled past human eyes already strained by flickering light. Pulse rates spiked again, then leveled. Stress responses remained elevated, yet purposeful. They reviewed casualty estimates, infrastructure damage, atmospheric degradation. They compiled assessments not of military value, but of human cost. Each transmission sent from the chamber carried these assessments outward, threading through layers of interference and jamming to reach the Council's systems. The content was flagged immediately. Humanitarian data during active hostilities was statistically irrelevant to strategic outcomes. It did not alter force balances or compliance probabilities. Yet the transmissions continued, steady and methodical, formatted according to diplomatic protocols that assumed mutual recognition of suffering as a variable worth acknowledging. Shockwaves rattled the chamber supports again, setting off a new chorus of alarms. The sound layered atop itself, frequencies overlapping until the noise became a physical pressure against the skull. The smell of overheated insulation grew stronger, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Somewhere within the spire, a system failed and was isolated, the abrupt cutoff sending a tremor through connected structures. Gravity wavered, a brief lightness followed by a heavy return that drove boots harder into the floor. Council analysts flagged the behavior as irrational persistence. Predictive models recalculated in real time, casualty probabilities climbing with each minute of continued exposure. Every curve showed the same conclusion. Remaining in the chamber under sustained bombardment increased risk without corresponding strategic gain. Negotiation efficacy dropped as stress accumulated, cognitive bandwidth eroded, and environmental hazards multiplied. Rational actors would disengage, regroup, and reinitiate talks later under safer conditions. The humans did none of this. Instead, they maintained protocol. They aligned their materials according to established order, anchoring data slates and instruments so they would not become projectiles. They checked and rechecked seals on environmental suits worn beneath diplomatic attire, subtle bulges and reinforced seams hinting at preparations for worst-case failure. Fingers brushed over familiar textures, the ridges of gloves, the smooth edges of personal tokens kept close to the body. Small habits surfaced under pressure, gestures that anchored them to identity and purpose. The bombardment outside showed no sign of slowing. Orbital strikes continued to hammer Caraxes, each impact a silent flash from this vantage point, each one translating into another shudder through the spire as frame. The dying blue star beyond the viewport pulsed steadily, indifferent to destruction, its cold light washing over the scene in pale bands. Against that vast, uncaring backdrop, the human presence seemed impossibly small, and yet it persisted. The Council's systems searched for explanation. Were the humans attempting to project resolve as a bargaining tactic? Were they miscalculating risk due to incomplete data? Were they driven by cultural imperatives that overrode self-preservation? Each hypothesis failed to fully account for the observed behavior. Persistence alone was not unusual. Persistence without escalation or retreat was. From the humans came no threats, no dramatic gestures, only continued engagement, continued observation, continued communication. Their refusal to fall silent under fire did not fit any known model of negotiation. Silence, according to logic, conserved resources and reduced exposure. Speech, even indirect, expended energy and attention. Yet the humans filled the chamber with quiet activity, with the soft sounds of breathing, of fingers tapping interfaces, of water containers being set down carefully. Fear was present. Sensors could not miss it. It lived in the tightness of shoulders, the micro tremors in hands held still by force of will, the shallow breaths taken between deeper, deliberate ones. Pain flickered across neural readings as joints absorbed repeated shocks and muscles strained to maintain posture. Hope, harder to quantify, appeared only as stubborn continuation, as refusal to abandon process even when outcomes seemed predetermined. The contradiction grew heavier with each passing moment. The humans were not winning. They were not even resisting in any conventional sense. They were enduring, choosing to remain visible and vulnerable in a space designed to crush vulnerability. Their logic was not absent. It was simply operating on parameters the Council had never encoded. If logic dictated silence, then this sustained engagement suggested something else entirely. Not desperation, not ignorance, but an escalation of a different kind. A statement made not through force or threat, but through presence. By staying, by continuing to act as if dialogue mattered even while the world burned, the humans implied that withdrawal was not the ultimate cost they feared. The chamber shook again, harder than before. A crack split open along a support column, light spilling from within as containment fields surged to compensate. The temperature spiked, then dropped, the air cycling through hot and cold in rapid succession. Somewhere far below, millions endured far worse with no shields at all. Within the spire, the humans remained seated, braced, alive. Water consumed, data transmitted, protocol observed. The Council watched, and for the first time since its founding, probability alone felt insufficient. Static crept into the command bands as a faint, irregular hiss, the kind that technicians associated with interference rather than failure. It threaded itself between clean signal lines, soft at first, then persistent, like breath caught in a throat that refused to clear. On the orbital command decks above Caraxes, the smell of recycled air grew sharp as stress hormones spiked among crews trained to expect broken transmissions, evacuation flares, and the sudden, silent absence that marked surrender. Instead, the channels remained open. Diplomatic traffic continued to flow from the battered negotiation spire, steady and uninterrupted, its signals stubbornly clean despite the violence tearing at the space around it. Each packet arrived with the same formal structure, the same adherence to protocol, as though the environment had not been reduced to shaking metal and falling dust. For the attackers, accustomed to the rhythm of conquest, this continuity felt wrong. It pressed against instinct like a low-grade pain, impossible to ignore. Another kinetic strike was authorized, its trajectory calculated to induce maximum structural resonance in the spire without immediate destruction. The weapon fell, silent and unseen, its impact registering moments later as a deep vibration that rippled outward through docking arms and support struts. The spire shuddered, alarms flared, and fragments of ancient material sheared free into the void. The signal did not stop. Orbital commanders watched their displays in growing unease. The expected cascade of failures did not arrive. There were no abrupt terminations, no panicked spikes followed by silence. Instead, there was adjustment, power rerouting, minor fluctuations smoothed out by active compensation. And always, the steady presence of diplomatic transmissions, unchanged in tone and structure, indifferent to the attempts to silence them. With each strike that failed to end the talks, uncertainty grew. Confidence, once a solid mass anchored by precedent and probability, began to erode at the edges. Tactical officers exchanged glances, their body language betraying doubt even as their voices remained disciplined and controlled. The models insisted that compliance was inevitable, yet reality refused to conform. The humans did not behave as defeated actors should. They did not escalate militarily, nor did they withdraw into silence. They simply remained. Sensors tracked the human vessels still drifting near the spire, their hulls scarred, their energy reserves strained. There were no reinforcements inbound, no hidden fleets emerging from dark space. The humans had not changed the battlefield in any measurable way. They had changed something else. Among allied observers within the council rings, a slow realization took hold. It spread not as a sudden insight, but as a creeping weight, a pressure behind thought. They watched the bombardment continue and yet fail in its unspoken purpose. They watched a species remain communicative under conditions that should have shattered cohesion. They watched fear and pain coexist with discipline and intent. This was not negotiation from weakness. In the long history of measured conflict, dialogue under fire had always signaled desperation, a last attempt to salvage something before collapse. What unfolded here felt different. The humans were not pleading. They were not offering concessions disproportionate to their position. They were behaving as though the act of remaining present mattered more than immediate outcomes. It dawned on the observers that the humans were establishing a boundary, not one drawn on star charts or defined by exclusion zones, but one etched into behavior. A line that said there existed a point beyond which pressure ceased to produce retreat. A boundary written in resolve rather than territory, enforced not by weapons, but by refusal. The bombardment began to change. Strike intervals lengthened, subtly at first. The perfect regularity of impacts gave way to uneven spacing as commanders hesitated, recalculating trajectories, reconsidering objectives. Salvos that had once fallen in disciplined patterns now arrived out of sequence, their geometry broken by second-guessing. The sound of impacts, translated into vibrations and data, lost its relentless rhythm and became sporadic, uncertain. On Caraxis, the effect was immediate and chaotic. Fires continued to burn, but new ones appeared less frequently. The ground still shook, but not with the same crushing inevitability. Civilians huddled in ruins and shelters felt the difference without understanding it. The brief pauses between impacts offering moments to breathe, to move, to hope. Above, in the spire, the humans felt it too. The vibrations lessened in intensity, the tremors becoming irregular rather than constant. Muscles long held taut eased by fractions, then tightened again as caution reasserted itself. Pain remained, fatigue deepened, but there was also something new in the air, a subtle shift that registered as possibility. The attackers felt exposed. Every additional strike risked reinforcing the message they could not afford to acknowledge. Each failed attempt to force withdrawal amplified the implication that force alone was insufficient. The idea spread through command structures like a contagion, unspoken yet pervasive. If these beings still spoke while the ground trembled, then what would they do when the bombardment escalated further? What threshold existed, if any, that would compel silence? Allied observers leaned closer to their displays, their own assumptions unraveling. Species that had survived by calculation alone now watched a different survival strategy unfold. Not reckless defiance, not martyrdom, but something colder and more enduring. The willingness to absorb suffering without relinquishing presence. The dying blue star cast its pale light across the unfolding hesitation, illuminating ships that now drifted rather than advanced, weapons platforms that held fire for heartbeats longer than doctrine allowed. The vastness of space pressed in on every side, a reminder of how small and fragile all life truly was. And yet, within that immensity, fragility had found a way to push back. The bombardment fractured further, devolving into disorganized salvos launched more from habit than conviction. Confidence bled away with each moment the humans remained engaged. The attackers had expected surrender or escalation. They received endurance. In the quiet gaps between impacts, something fundamental shifted. War, which had begun as a calculated correction, now carried uncertainty no equation had predicted. The humans had not won. They had not even stopped the attack. They had changed its meaning. As the spire continued to stand, scarred but unbroken, as the diplomatic channel stayed open against all expectation, the universe learned a lesson it would not soon forget. There existed a kind of strength that did not announce itself with fire. A strength that endured shaking ground and still chose to speak. And once that strength revealed itself, nothing proceeded as planned again. The silence arrived without ceremony, slipping into the negotiation spire like a held breath finally released. Vibrations faded first, the bone-deep tremor dissolving into stillness so gradual it took long moments to notice. Alarms wound down one by one, their layered harmonics thinning into isolated tones before cutting off entirely. Dust continued to drift for a while, motes suspended in the air, illuminated by flickering lights that now steadied into a constant glow. The smell of scorched metal lingered, sharp and acrid, but beneath it emerged something else, the neutral scent of recycled air finally unchallenged by heat and rupture. The firing had ceased. No shockwave followed. No delayed impact arrived to contradict the quiet. Outside the viewport, weapons platforms held position without discharging, their silhouettes stark against the pale wash of the dying blue star. The void felt wider in the absence of violence, its vastness pressing in now that motion and noise had withdrawn. On Caraxes below, fires still burned and clouds of debris still hung in wounded skies, but no new scars were being carved into the planet's skin. Within the spire, the humans did not move at first. Muscles remained braced, bodies held in the memory of repeated shocks. Heart rates stayed elevated, unwilling to trust the sudden calm. Pain, long ignored, surfaced in waves as adrenaline ebbed, joints aching, nerves burning where strain had accumulated. Breaths came shallow, then deepened slowly, deliberately, as each individual confirmed that the quiet was real, that it held. There was no celebration, no release of tension into triumph, no gestures that marked victory. The humans did not rise from their places or turn toward the viewport to witness the end of the bombardment. Instead, they resumed the same careful motions they had maintained under fire. Data slates were adjusted. Environmental readings were reviewed. Seals and supports were checked for delayed failures. Water was consumed again, small measured sips taken to counter dehydration that had crept in unnoticed during hours of endurance. They continued. Negotiation protocols, already active, remained in effect. Information packets were transmitted with the same structure and cadence as before, their tone unchanged by the absence of immediate threat. The humans behaved as though the violence had been an opening argument rather than a conclusion, a brutal preface that did not negate the necessity of what followed. Their focus did not shift to recounting losses or assigning blame. It remained fixed on process, on articulation, on the slow, deliberate work of engagement. From the council chambers, observation systems recorded the transition with meticulous precision. The moment of ceasefire was time-stamped, its conditions catalogued, its irregularity flagged. Analysts searched for the expected markers of psychological shift, relief spikes, euphoria, collapse. They found none significant enough to satisfy precedent. Human stress indicators declined gradually, controlled rather than precipitous. Cognitive performance stabilized and, in some measures, improved. The absence of triumph was as disconcerting as the endurance that had preceded it. The Council of Measured Species convened emergency review subroutines, comparing this event against millennia of recorded conflicts. No declaration of victory followed the cessation of fire. No formal acknowledgement of success was demanded or offered. The humans did not behave as conquerors, nor as survivors narrowly spared. They behaved as participants who had never left the conversation. The event was logged as an anomaly of profound significance. Deep within the Council's predictive cores, a new classification was created, its parameters defined with unusual caution. This was not escalation in the conventional sense. It was not deterrence by force or compliance by attrition. It was something quieter and more destabilizing. The refusal to disengage even when destruction was imminent. The insistence that dialogue was not a reward for peace, but a condition of existence. From this classification emerged a new axiom, entered into galactic doctrine with layers of annotation and warning. When humans continued to negotiate amid destruction, it marked not the end of conflict, but its true beginning. A signal that the encounter had crossed into territory where standard models failed and deeper consequences followed. Allied observers felt the weight of it settle into their collective understanding. Species that had evolved under the tyranny of efficiency and survival curves now grasped a different calculus. The humans had demonstrated that calm under fire was not passivity. It was not surrender. It was preparation. On Caraxis, rescue efforts began even as smoke still rose from shattered cities. Humanitarian signals multiplied, coordinated with a speed born of long familiarity with catastrophe. Lives were still being lost, pain still unfolding in countless private moments, but there was also movement toward recovery. Not because the war had been won, but because survival demanded action regardless of outcome. In the Spire, the humans felt the cost of what they had done settle into their bodies. Exhaustion crept in, heavy and undeniable. Some leaned back against supports, eyes closing briefly as systems stabilized. Others flexed stiff fingers, rolling shoulders that ached from hours of tension. Beneath the fatigue lay grief, sharp and unresolved, for the world that had burned while they sat beneath shaking walls and chose to remain. They carried that grief with them into the negotiations. The dying blue star continued its slow pulse, indifferent to doctrine and revelation alike. Its light washed over the council chambers, over the spire, over the wounded planet below, illuminating the fragile threads of life stretched across impossible distances. In that light, humanity appeared small, transient, painfully vulnerable. And yet, from that day forward, rational empires learned caution. Not fear of human weapons, nor of human numbers, but of human persistence. They learned that when humans spoke calmly while the ground trembled, it was not because they failed to understand danger. It was because they understood it too well to let it dictate their silence. Humanity's calm under fire became a promise, etched into galactic memory. A promise that if negotiation continued in the face of annihilation, then what followed would not be simple, not quick, not easily calculated. The universe, vast and indifferent, adjusted ever so slightly around that truth. And nothing that encountered humanity again would ever make the mistake of believing that silence meant safety, or that endurance meant surrender.